Hello and welcome to lesson 11.2 on the human respiratory system. So the good news is that much of what we've learned in this section will be a refresher from grade 10 science with a few added details. So let's just talk first for a minute. Just explore the diagram that I have here on the screen and see, well, what is familiar, what is unfamiliar? Could you predict the order? Of the order of where is the oxygen that you're inspiring going. So let's just go through it. So first of all, imagine that you are a molecule of oxygen being inhaled. You're going to move through one of two possible routes. You're going to go through either the mouth, the oral cavity, or the nasal cavity, which I'm going to focus on today. We've talked a lot about the mouth and its structures in our digestive system, so we're going to kind of work more on our nasal cavity today. So from there, it's going to go to a structure called the pharynx. And we're going to describe all of these structures a little bit later on in this screencast. Once our oxygens move through the pharynx, it's going to move through our larynx. And I'm hoping that you know what the very important function of the larynx is. I'm going to expand a little bit about on these sort of areas as well. From there, it's going to move on across the epiglottis. The epiglottis is, of course, that structure that helps us to, make sure that when we're eating, we don't have our food go down the wrong tube, quote unquote. And then, of course, the trachea onto the bronchi, and then onto the bronchioles, and last but not least, the alveoli. So, often the human respiratory system is described sort of like as an upside down tree of sorts. It's often called the bronchial trunk, in fact. And you can sort of see where that's coming from, right? Trunk, and then, bigger branches, and then smaller branches with little fruit things at the end, just like the alveoli. Okay, so important to know that expiration or exhaling is going to result in our CO2 that we're trying to get rid of just being pushed out of our body. Okay, so now take a look at this diagram. Now, I don't need you to memorize the details of this particular diagram. You don't need to know it. It's just there to help you visualize a little bit. So on the inside, here's our nasal cavity. You can see these sort of little indentations, and those are special bones called turbinate bones. On the surface of your nasal cavity, in fact, also in your trachea as well, you're going to have ciliated cells, cells with cilia on them. And the purpose of that cilia, along with the mucus that's coating the cilia, is essentially just to trap foreign material that's coming in, like, even viruses before they, go into your body. They're kind of like as a bit of a death trap for foreign materials coming into your body. So, let's write a little bit down about that. So our nasal cavity, it's going to be lined with these epithelial cells. That's just a coating cell that has hair-like projections. And those hair-like projections have the job of sweeping out some foreign material. And I thought it'd be nice to add in a little cross-section of, microscope slide of the inside of the nasal cavity. There you can see the ciliated cells that are there to trap. A little bit. I want to take another look at the nasal cavity, but this from like more of a frontal perspective, right? So we have sinuses, the maxillary sinuses and our frontal sinuses. And if you've ever had a head cold, you know what those feel like. Here's your nose, right? And the bridge of your nose, that's all made of cartilage, and it divides your nose into two halves. So septum, it means like dividing into two. We're going to see the word septum. We talk about the heart as well. And in fact, if you have a deviated septum, then you might end up having some rhinoplasty to fix that. But what I want to focus on here are these turbinate bones. Um, and so if you, uh, if when you were a kid you ever reached in there, you might actually feel them. Not encouraging that at this point, however. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit more about those bones and what their purpose is. So, um, essentially, the theme here, and the theme through the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the circulatory system that we haven't yet spoken about is surface area. You know, all of these organ systems are going to have some sort of structure built in, or multiple structures to enhance surface area, because that just optimizes a bunch of things like gas exchange or absorption and so on and so forth. So, you know, as we mentioned, we saw that those ciliated cells on our turbinate bones, they're going to be secreting mucus, and the mucus is there to serve a couple of functions. First, it's going to moisten the air, and if you've ever, you know, and that moistening the air, also it kind of warms it up as well. You'll remember that, you know, well, you may, yeah, I think we spoke about it in the last screencast about how surfaces need to be moist in order for gas exchange to occur at all. So here's an example of that. Um, and you know, our turbinates are also lined with capillaries, and capillaries carry blood, and blood should be warm, and it's just going to essentially help to warm that air as it's moving into our respiratory system so that it's not a shock to our lungs. And if you've ever breathed in on a really cold day, then you know how that feels in your nose. So um, we don't want that in our body, right? So, um, what else was I going to talk about? I don't know what else I was going to talk about. I think that's it for this. Oh, sometimes they're called concha or conchi, singular concha, plural conchi. So if you see that somewhere, just know that's the same thing as our turbinate bones. I think I just have the same slide here, so I'm going to move through. All right. So we've breathed in our air into our nasal cavity. Here you can see this nice side view of our turbinates or conchi. But then we're gonna breathe in, and our air is gonna pass through into the pharynx. And so the pharynx has three subsections. It's, you know, typically when we say throat, we're describing the pharynx, although some people will hold their neck and say throat. So, you know, there you have it. But we can further divide the pharynx into three sections. The nasopharynx, I think that name makes sense. It's attached to the nasal cavity. Next is the oropharynx, and notice here is your mouth. Here's your mouth opening. Here's your oral cavity right there. This is your tongue, supramuscular. So oro meaning oral, right? It's the part of the pharynx that is attached to your mouth. And then last, there's the laryngopharynx, which is attached very proximal to, very close to your larynx. So there we have it. So what is the function of the pharynx? It's basically to connect your nasal cavity to your trachea. Oops, I went a little too fast there. Let me back up. To your trachea, which is right here. By the way, esophagus in behind, trachea right here in front. Okay, so now let's expand a little bit on the larynx, which is where we're going to next. So we identified the larynx as being just sort of um, proximal to the laryngopharynx. Um, and so I want to talk about it. So let's do that. The larynx, hopefully you thought about it as being the voice box. So the larynx is a structure in our respiratory system that has air passing through it, and that is what that vibrates and creates sound that we can perceive. It's made of this tough cartilage, and that's to help prevent it from collapsing, which would be devastating. You can crush your larynx, and then that can have devastating effects on your ability to produce sound. So the air passing through the larynx, you can think of your larynx as being, well, you have vocal cords, so not unlike guitar strings where they vibrate, and that vibration will create sound. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these other structures here in a minute. Um, but let's first take a look at, and this is more of an FYI. You don't really need to know the structures herein, but it is interesting. So imagine you're just looking down on your throat, right? So the air is going in here. You have your this is when your vocal folds are open, and then here are your vocal cords, and then they'll be kind of moving together when you're speaking or singing. So let's look at like a real picture of that, right? So there you can sort of see that in action, your larynx with like a top-down view in your throat. Okay, so now I'm going to expand on some of the other structures in the larynx, like the epiglottis. In our digestion chapter, we spoke about it, but here's that flap that when you swallow the food, it kind of catches on the edge of the epiglottis, and the epiglottis closes, and the food just moves down your esophagus instead of into your trachea. So that's your epiglottis. The other piece, and then we've talked about vocal cords. The other piece is the glottis. The glottis is basically the opening of the trachea where the air is going to enter into your larynx. That's basically what it is. Um, and as we spoke about before, that epiglottis is going to serve to prevent you from choking while you're eating. Okay, so let me just back up for 1 second here. So inspired air is going through your pharynx, down through your larynx, and into your trachea. That is where we're going next. So here is your trachea. And here we have the thyroid cartilage, which is covering your thyroid gland. There's your Adam's apple that becomes more pronounced, particularly in men, and women do have an Adam's apple, but it just doesn't grow as large. And then we have our tracheal cartilage. So our trachea is essentially what some people will call our windpipe. And if you've ever kind of been hit in the throat, then you know that doesn't, well, it's not the throat really, right? Because, it's the pharynx would be more our throat. But if you've ever been hit there, then you know what that feels like. It's not a great feeling. So it's lined with some really tough cartilage, and the purpose of that is just basically to protect. Remember that oxygen is essential for brain function, and so that cartilage helps to keep your respiratory tract from kind of collapsing on itself and not being able to get oxygen in efficiently. That's the main purpose. But essentially, its role is pretty simple. Aside from just having that cartilage to prevent collapse, it's also just simply, a means of getting air from your nasal cavity to your lungs. That's about it. So zooming in on the rest of our respiratory system, I'm just going to expand this window if I can. Um, nope, not going to happen. Anyway, it's all good. So here again is our trachea. Now the trachea branch into our bronchi, and bronchi, all they are just like big branches, and we need each of those branches to go to our left and right lungs. Now remember, we're looking at this and this appears on the left, but it's actually the right lung, because you just have to imagine that it's on you. And so we have to think about the mirror image there. And then each bronchus for singular, each bronchus kind of divides further into smaller bronchi or bronchioles. So that's basically all we need to talk about here. It's going to branch off. Why does it need to branch off? Because we have two lungs, one on the left and one on the right. So we need that trachea to branch off. And so it's going to further branch off into these structures called bronchioles. They're eventually going to lead to what we've already seen, which are the alveoli. Here's just a different image of the same thing, showing our rib cage, showing our diaphragm, our muscular diaphragm, and then just showing the cross section of the lung. So the last picture it kind of highlights the structures, but doesn't have all of the lung tissue in there. But here you can see the bronchi and then the bronchioles, and that's about all there is there. Okay, so now we're just about at the end of this. So we've got talked about air going into the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles. But what I really liked about this picture is it kind of highlights really well these sacs at the end of the bronchioles, those alveoli. And if we were to zoom in on one of them, just one of them, then what we would see are it's like these sac-like structures. Um, and there are many, many of them. And I'm hoping what you also notice is that each of these sac-like structures, each alveoli, is surrounded by a huge capillary network. And that capillary network has the function of just making sure that our alveoli are able to, act as an efficient membrane in transferring oxygen from the external environment, that external respiration, into our internal environment, which would be the bloodstream. So let's just talk a little bit more about the alveoli. First of all, what are they? Well, they're just little air sacs at the end of our bronchioles. And what is important about their structure? Well, they have high surface area, and that just allows for efficient gas exchange to occur across its surface, right? In fact, we have, it depends on what study you look at. There's a range, obviously, there just like there is, range with normal range for human height, there's a normal range for the number of alveoli per lung. But there are a lot of them, like a lot. 3 to 400 million per lung is like that's just one of the ranges that you'll find out there. I've seen other ranges where it's talking like 270 to 700 and something alveoli, a million alveoli per lung. So, really, if we were to stretch that out, they say that it would cover basically the size of a tennis court, all wrapped up beautifully in our lung, in our chest cavity. Crazy, really. Um, and so what are they surrounded by? Say it, say it. A capillary network. And what is the point of that, you say? That's where gas exchange is happening. All right. So that is it. We are done the second of two screencasts today on the human respiratory system. You're going to be asked to do a worksheet on lung volumes, where you're going to learn about all of these different terms that are used in medicine, and particularly if you're a respiratory therapist. Then you're going to learn about lung volumes, inspiratory and expiratory lung volumes. And so I think you'll find that interesting. Now, normally in class we would turn that into a lab, and we would actually measure our own, and I think it's still important for you to understand those ideas. And you should know that respiratory therapy is a really important and purpose-filled career where you get to help people with breathing problems. It is in the field of medicine, and it's an adjacent position to, our nurses and our doctors and our paramedics and our x-ray technicians. Respiratory therapists work in the hospital setting typically, and perform and do medical tests on real live human beings. So if that's something that interests you, there are many, many college programs that provide opportunities for you to study and become a respiratory technologist. So that's all I have for today. If you have any questions or need some clarification, I'm happy to help. Just join us in today's Zoom meeting link, and we can have a chat.